Please pray with me. Gracious God, thanks for the young people in our life. Thank you for our children, for the students, for the young kids, and for the old kids. Thank you that you make us just the way we are, that you call us to be more like you, Jesus, and that everything about us that you have made, you love. And all God's people said, amen. Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. So I'm reading the gospel passage this week, and I'm like, man, Jesus isn't going to give us a break here, is he? Like, holy cow. Last week, he's talking about making sure that we don't store up the abundance of possessions and our extra funds. And there's this like parable about a rich man who was actually discovered to be a fool later on in the parable because he believed that what the land had produced and what he had earned actually belonged to him instead of God. And now, this week, sell your possessions, give alms, like where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I mean, how well does God know us, right? It's almost as if the parables and the stories of Jesus span generations and can speak into our lives no matter what the topic, right? It's like we all nod and say, yes, that's true, of course, but we still have to deal with this sell possessions and give alms stuff. It's like, what do we do with that? Just to clarify here, the word that gets translated as giving alms literally means an act of mercy by giving to the poor. So, here in the United States of America, we're pretty pragmatic when it comes to our money, I think. Like as Americans, we kind of want that no-nonsense, reasonable, sensible talk when it comes to money things. As Jesus followers, it's not that different, right? It's true. We tend to gravitate towards the whole, hey, tell me what Jesus says, but then tell me how it's not going to cause me to have to rethink my spending and saving habits way of thinking, all right? Like we want to know that it's going to be worth it. Because if it's not worth it, it's not really worth our time or our money. Well, I'm going to tell you a couple stories that I've heard over the years. And from as much as I can tell and as much as I trust the sources that I've heard them from, they're all true stories. Story number one. A local priest was attending a fundraising dinner at another church in the community. And this church was raising money to help rural young women learn things like job skills, gaining self-confidence, all these sorts of things. And a man was up there giving a talk and had all these, lots of numbers, target dates, specific goals. And he actually did a really good job of presenting that information. And when he was done, he opened it up for questions for everyone who was in attendance. And a woman at the back raised her hand. And she said, all of that information that you just shared, that was great. It was really good. But we need to hear stories about the young women that you've helped. Like, we want to see their faces. We want to have, like, tangible results in our hands before we'll give. And she's right. Like, we want that. We like to see the building, and we like to see what it's going to look like before we'll give to the cost of having it built. Some of us will actually research where the pennies on the dollar go when we give so that we know exactly where the money's going so it goes to where we want it to go. And if we're going to sell our possessions and give alms, we want to see the results, right? We want to see that those results are going to be worth it. The thing is, Jesus' vision of giving it doesn't really have that. Like any of it. He doesn't have pictures and high glossy brochures to hand out and examples of what's going to happen when the alms are given. It's like for Jesus, that's just not all that relevant. And it'd be easy for us to look at this passage that we just had by itself, out of context, and expect a sermon about, we got to be ready for when Jesus comes again. But always look at the context. Just before this passage, Jesus speaks really familiar words to a lot of us. He says, therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or your body, what you will wear. Then he goes on and he talks about birds and flowers and reminds his followers, look, God cares for and provides for them. How much more is God going to provide for and care for you? And then the sentence that is immediately before our passage this morning, Jesus says, instead, strive for God's kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Seek God's kingdom, and the rest will come. The next words out of Jesus' mouth are in our gospel passage. Don't be afraid. It's like, spoiler alert, when Jesus says that, what's coming next could get a little scary. Don't be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. It's like, do you hear the verb that Jesus uses about what we're supposed to do when it comes to God's kingdom? It's the word strive or seek in other translations. Not build or grow God's kingdom, not bring or advance God's kingdom. A lot of Jesus followers like to insert those verbs before the words God's kingdom. But those aren't Jesus' words. We're supposed to strive and seek. And then we receive it because it's God's good pleasure to give us the kingdom. We seek and receive, God gives. And then Jesus invites us to do as God does and give. So we seek, God gives. We give, and others receive. God gives us what we need, and we give others as they need. We actually become imitators of God, just as Paul tells the Christians in Ephesians and Thessalonians to do. It's like God sees us as worth it. Story number 2. There's a white woman, and her name is Anne. And she began attending an African American Presbyterian church. Anne was an alcoholic, broke, single, and pregnant. Like at the end of her rope. And yet, the people at this church, they tie a knot at the end of the rope to help her hold on. They surround her, they love her, they give her food and clothing. They assured her that that baby was going to have a family. And then the older women at the church, they start slipping her money, even when they themselves, many of them are living paycheck to paycheck. There was one woman in her 80s, African-American woman named Mary, and she would put dimes into little Ziploc bags and slip them into Anne's pockets when she wasn't looking. Years go by, Anne recovers from her alcoholism, raises her child, she begins to work steadily, her fortune, like her financial situation changes and is reversed, and yet still, every so often, Mary would slip little Ziploc bags of dimes into Anne's pockets. And Anne would then typically find them and give them away to someone else who needed them more than she did. But she kept a couple of those bags of dimes around her house as a reminder of who God is and what God is like. Mary was simply imitating God. She gave and then kept on giving. It was her way of life. Mary saw Anne as worth it. And I mean, that's the real trick, isn't it? Like our temptation is to like grab and clutch and hold on, desperately hold on to what we have. Some of us are really good at this. I know I am, right? Like we have lots of practice. We worry, we get anxious. We do the very thing that Jesus teaches us not to do. And when we do that, we start to think that our possessions are our possessions. Like we fall into temptation. We build bigger storehouses and barns. We might even begin to want to protect it and become fearful of those who might benefit from the generosity of giving alms. But this letting go and selling of possessions, giving of alms, we know it's not about the money, right? Like once again, Jesus isn't going left or right. Jesus goes deep. And there's a deeper issue going on here. And it's one that I think that Mary discovered. It's a way of life that Paul talks about in Colossians, a life that is hidden in Christ, hidden with Christ in God. That life is given to us. Like there's no need to clutch it, protect it, store it up. It's this beautiful, free, pure gift from God. And it is God's pleasure to give it to us. But again, it's almost like Jesus knows us, right? It's not easy for us to receive from God when we are clutching and grabbing and holding on to our way of life. So Jesus says, fine, sell your possessions, give alms. Yeah, it's a physical act of selling and giving, but it's much more a spiritual act of worship. Like we let go in order to receive. We participate in God's kingdom. Story number 3, and last story. Many years ago, there was a man, his name was Francis. Francis loved God, but Francis also loved himself. He was kind of one of those guys who longed for fame, fortune, and glory. One day he was praying in church, and he heard the voice of God speaking to him from the crucifix hanging over the altar. And the voice said, "Francis, do you see that my house is in ruins? Go, restore it for me." Well, Francis takes God literally, and he began to rebuild and restore the very church building that he was sitting in. The issue was that his methods were a little dicey. Francis went straight to his father, Pietro, who was a wealthy fabric merchant, and stole several bolts of fabric. Goes and sells the fabric and then uses the money to start rebuilding the church. Quite ingenious, if you ask some people. But his dad didn't exactly see it that way, and his father actually informed the authorities. Francis went into hiding for several weeks out of fear and spends that time in prayer. During that time, this sense of calm and almost purpose came over him. He left his hideaway spot and went and presented himself to the bishop. And he's standing there before the bishop, his father, and a bunch of the people from the town, because they all want to know what's going to happen. And Francis says the following: "Up to this time, I have called Pietro father, but now I am the servant of God. Not only the money, but everything that can be called his, I will restore to my father, even the very clothes he has given me." Yeah. And right then and there, in front of God, the bishop, his father, and everyone, he stripped down to his underwear, tosses a bag of money on top of the pile of clothes, asks his bishop for a blessing, and walked out of church, into the forest, barefoot, and almost buck naked. And he was singing songs of praise to God as he did it. 2 years after Francis's death, he got a prefix in front of his name. You know what it was? Saint. As in Saint Francis of Assisi. Now, please, as you walk out of church today, don't go barefoot or bear anything else, but do feel free to sing to God. And remember Mary, who imitated God and continued to give even when she didn't have to. Remember St. Francis, a man who gave away his possessions, his money, his life, and lost that part of his life, and yet gained true freedom and a truly joyful life. May we strive and seek God's kingdom, giving as God gives. Because, my friends, it's worth it. Amen.